Welcome, and we'll get started in just a moment. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here this evening. I'm Kristen Motti, an adult programs librarian at the Boston Public Library. Tonight's conversation about Dr. Adam Stern's new memoir, Committed: Dispatches from a Psychiatrist in Training, is presented in partnership with the State Library of Massachusetts. Beth Carol Horrocks from the State Library will join us in just a moment to share how you can buy a copy of the book from our partner bookseller for tonight's talk, Trident Booksellers, and also to introduce tonight's guest moderator, Dr. Suzanne Koven. First, just a few items of housekeeping though, and we'll do this really quick. Most of you are probably familiar about Zoom. We are in Zoom webinar space, so your microphones and your cameras are muted, but we do want to hear from you, so you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type your questions for Dr. Stern. And we also will, throughout the program, have the chat box open for links to share with you. Use the Q&A button for questions and comments to us, but we'll use the chat button to share out how to buy the book, websites, other information as the program goes on. Closed captioning, if you'd like that on or off, can be toggled on or off by the live transcript button with the CC also on the bottom of your screen. So you can go ahead and click on that if you want to turn that on or off. Now, just a little bit about tonight's guest author, Dr. Adam Stern, MD. Dr. Stern is a psychiatrist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, both here in Boston. His writing has been published in numerous publications, including the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, to name a few. He has also appeared on CNN and is a cartoonist. Committed is his first book. We'll welcome Adam in just a moment. First, Beth Carol Horrocks. Beth, welcome, and over to you.
All right. Thank you, Kristen, and hello, everyone. A very quick hello from the State Library of Massachusetts, where I am the head of special collections. So the pandemic has brought us many unpleasant things, but one of the things we're most grateful for is our ability to collaborate with new partners and reach a much larger audience for all of our author talks and public programming. So we're very grateful to be here tonight to hear Adam Stern and Suzanne Koven talk about Adam's new book. And we're very glad too that it's such a local and a very universal topic. So Adam is going to be in conversation tonight with Dr. Suzanne Koven, who has had a fascinating career in both medicine and literature. She's practiced primary care internal medicine here in Boston for over 25 years at Mass General Hospital. And she's also the inaugural writer in residence there since 2019. She's written for a variety of publications and published this year her book, Letter to a Young Female Physician, Notes from a Medical Life. And that was published through W.W. Norton. There are links to her website and her social media sites in the chat. And we will hear more from Dr. Koven shortly. So just a brief note about the book, and we'll have this information available to you at the end of the talk as well. But if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, copies of Committed can be purchased through our partners at Trident Books in Boston. So if you use the link on the slide and in the chat with the code BPLSHIP, so BPL SHIP, for free media mail shipping, and there are a limited number of signed copies available. So, Adam, we are all going to learn a lot tonight from a perfect person to talk to us about your career and what it means to be a psychiatrist, and we're going to enjoy your conversation with Dr. Koven. So over to you both.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. And first, let me just thank everyone for being here virtually. Let me thank Beth and Kristen and our hosts, Boston Public Library, Massachusetts Library Association. Let me thank Trident. I actually had my the rehearsal dinner before my wedding at Trident when we were doing such things. And so all of these places have a special place in my heart. And a special thank you to Dr. Suzanne Koven for agreeing to doing this for me. What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about my book, Committed, the road that led to it. I'm going to read a very, very short section, and then I will open it up for discussion with Dr. Koven and answer questions from the audience as well. So if I'm going to start at the beginning, I'll just say that I have been writing for really as long as I can remember in different forms. Writing's always felt like something I just sort of need to do in order to process the world around me. I say in the book that if I knew I could have made it as a screenwriter, this might be a very different memoir, because I have always had a sort of passion and a drive to do that kind of thing. It took a little bit of a back seat at some point during my medical training. And it wasn't until I was a fully boarded psychiatrist on faculty at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center that I picked it up again in earnest, because in 2018, I was actually diagnosed with a very serious cancer diagnosis, a kidney cancer. And it was incredibly sort of earth-shattering, life-threatening. Any description you want to apply probably fits. Everything you might imagine it to be, it was. And I found that the only way I could really make sense of my experience of it was to write about it. And then once I started writing these essays about what my perspective was as a patient, which in the prior 8 or so years, I had really only known it as a physician working with patients. And now I was both a physician working with patients and a patient working with physicians. And I started writing about that overlay, that intersection. And once these essays started being written, I found I actually went to the hospital medical center's media relations contact, and I said, I've got this essay, what do you think about it? And she helped me connect it with WBUR, which is the local NPR station. And that sort of set me off on this road of I can write something and actually reveal something about myself, and it can find an audience, and it was like blasted out to like NPR's millions of people on their social media. And I got all these messages back about how they connected with what I had written. And that was a transformative moment in my writing career, because I started to realize that I can do this and actually have success with it. And that all of my prior writing had been very much creative, but not so self-revealing. And what I learned over the last 3 years of living with this disease is that when I am more honest and open and self-revealing, it actually connects with readers in a more honest and earnest way. And that sort of went in a stepwise fashion. I lost that sort of fear of rejection that a lot of writers have about submitting to any editor or any place that you might want to see your book. I lost that entirely, and I began really just writing pieces when the mood struck and submitting them. And they found a home. They found acceptance in these various places in a way I never would have expected. And it was only that experience that led to the opportunity to actually write this book, Committed. And Committed has nothing to do with my illness. It actually takes place entirely before the illness. So how do those things connect? Well, Committed was the book that there were two things about Committed that allowed me to write that story. The first is that Committed is the book that I felt like, and Dr. Koven, I hope will appreciate this idea. It was the book that I felt like I could write that no one else necessarily could write. It was my particular story, both in becoming a psychiatrist at Harvard, but also in meeting my wife and figuring out how to connect with her, with the people in my life, with my patients. And it was based on a foundation of my particular journey. And so I thought, if I can tell this story that I don't think it's quite been told in this way ever before, a lot of medical memoirs, a lot of psychiatry writing, but not necessarily in the way that I presented it. I think I can do something unique. And the story just happens to take place in that 4-year span when I was in training, starting out from when I've just graduated from medical school and ending with my graduation from residency and accepting the position that I'm still in today. So what I'd like to do is read you a very short section, and then I can't wait to start talking it over with Dr. Koven, who for the rest of the talk, at her request, I will refer to as Suzanne. So for anyone who has the hardcover edition, I'm going to be reading starting the beginning of chapter 9, which is called Night Float, and that is on page 69. The timing, and I just want to set the context of this, is occurring in the middle of my first year, and night float is a phrase that refers to being on call, working overnight, sleeping, trying to sleep during the day. And it was probably the first time in my life that I experienced anything like that. And I hope it'll give you a flavor for what the sort of style of the book is and what the content is. The timing of my new romance was awful. I was entering night float, a rotation that involved working 2 consecutive weeks in a row, completely at night. That rotation would be immediately followed by Ashley's long winter break. I remembered how wonderfully mundane and restorative it was as a college student to have an entire month off in the middle of winter, and wondered how I had come so far from that life in such a short time. Medical schools offer one last summer break after the first year, and then no extended breaks for the remaining 3 years. Then residency treats time off like any other job, but with more restrictions, because someone has to be in the hospital to take care of patients at all times. An individual resident's vacations are always highly coordinated with other members of the class and at the discretion of the program overall. Over the next 2 weeks, the person staying with all the hospital's psychiatric patients overnight would be me, along with the second-year resident, Rebecca. We would start service at 6 o'clock each night and work nonstop until the sun rose, when we would begin to prepare our verbal sign out for the day team. This was supposed to occur by 8 a.m., and then we were to go home and try to sleep in broad daylight before starting the whole process again. There was no rest for the weary on night float. I would soon learn that with all those loose ends to be tied up and the complexities of the cases to convey, that getting out by 8 was a fantasy. After a particularly quiet night, I could sometimes make it home by 10, leaving only 8 hours until I was due back at the hospital, showered and ready to carry the load of the entire day team once again. It was an unrealistic race with the clock to fall asleep as fast as I could, leaving no time for any social activities at all. I had only been able to see her, this is referring to Ashley, a second time the night before the new rotation started, and I soon discovered that even finding times to text with Ashley proved to be difficult, and seeing her would be impossible. Worse still, I knew that by the time my schedule returned me to daylight, Ashley would be off at home in Arizona until the end of January. The early embers of a relationship needed to be stoked, but how could they be? As I walked onto 4 South on the first Sunday night, Rachel was waiting to give me sign out. How bad is it? I asked. Up here, it's fine, but downstairs is a mess, she said, referring to the green zone of the ER, where patients needing psychiatric services were located. But really what I want to know is, how bad was your date last night? It was fine. Good again, actually. Are you sure? Yeah, we had a nice time. Stop. Not interested anymore. I felt the blood start to gather in my chest and face. Sometimes I found Rachel to be infuriating. Her patients always seemed to find a structured and casually empathic calm in her therapeutic encounters, but she had a tendency to make my blood pressure rise with her casual dismissiveness of me. Over the course of her giving me sign out on each of the patients, my pager went off 3 times. It was Rebecca from the green zone. Need assistance. Come down after sign out's done. Rebecca, 1755. Seriously, situation deteriorating rapidly. Come down stat. R, 1803. SOS 911. R, 1809. Well, I better get down there. Good luck. You're going to need it. I stopped for 2 croissants and 2 coffees in the lobby coffee shop on my way to the ER. I typed in the 5-digit code to get into the bunker, a tiny room with no windows, that the psychiatry staff holed up in to get work done when near the emergency room. There I found Rebecca staring blankly at the whiteboard that listed all the patients waiting to be seen. Breakfast? I asked. You stopped for coffee? There's no time for coffee. Look at this. Look. There were 8 patients waiting to be seen. I don't understand how they can have a whole team of residents and attendings during the day and leave one second-year resident to carry the load all night. Well, and an intern, I added. She shot me a look. Right, and you. Well, we better divide and conquer. You take these 4 and don't send anyone home without first presenting the case to me. Understood? Aye, aye. But she was already at the door with her clipboard. I sighed and took a slug of my coffee, looking up at the names of the 4 patients Rebecca had assigned me. What the heck? I'm just going to sub in a bleep there, I asked. It was practically my whole patient list from the month before. Jane, Paul, Ginger, and Deborah were all back in the ER within a matter of weeks. Impossible. What's impossible? A woman from the other side of the room asked without looking up from her computer. Oh, nothing. I'm just surprised to see some of these names. I turned my gaze from board to woman and stationed across the room. You've been sitting there this whole time? She nodded. Who are you? I'm Nancy, the bed finder. I find all these patients' beds either here or around the city when they're admitted. You're going to want to be nice to me because I'm the only way these patients get out of your ER. Good to know, Nancy. Want a croissant and a coffee? Well, thank you very much, she said, sticking out her hand, still not looking away from the screen. So what's impossible? It's just this list of patients I've been assigned. They're all the patients I was taking care of up on 4 South. So what? Well, they were doing well when I discharged them. I guess I'm just surprised to see them back here. Kid, they always come back. They always bounce back, excuse me. I took a bite of my croissant and headed out with the clipboard and I found next to the printer. I'm going to pause there. And let me shift gears for a moment. And just before I open it up with Suzanne, I just want to say how delighted I am that she's joined us tonight. Suzanne and I have a handful of things in common and a few things that are different between us. And if I may take the liberty of outlining a few of them here before we open it up. We're both from medical families. We both have parents who are physicians. We are physician writers affiliated with Harvard Medical School. We both have recent books. Suzanne's book, Letter to a Young Female Physician, is amazing and really should be, and frankly is becoming required reading for medical trainees around the country and the world, I would say. And I think that we both also, just judging from her book anyway, we both have a need for, at least in our lives, we've experienced this need for achievement and sometimes overachievement or continuing to achieve, which reminds me that she also went on to get an MFA. And so we've written these books that cover imposter syndrome. And sometimes someone will ask me, well, how did you get over imposter syndrome? And it's a moment like, starting a conversation with Suzanne where I say, well, she's a real writer. She has an MFA. I'm just having this event, this isn't really, I'm not a real writer. I'm just and I realized like, it's not really something I've gotten over or that any of us necessarily get over, but rather something that we learn how to cope with and live with and overcome maybe. So with that, I want to open it up and throw it to you, Suzanne. Thank you so much for being here.
Adam, thank you so much for those kind words. I think it's typical of what I know about you that you spent so much time celebrating me at your party. So let's talk about your book, and we're going to hit imposter syndrome hard in a moment. But thank you for reading that passage, and thank you for writing this beautiful book. It's just great storytelling. It's just a great memoir, and it's just really interesting for people who want to know about the sort of the inside story of psychiatric training. But I think it's something else too, which is I think it's a real gift. The stereotype about psychiatrists is that they're very inaccessible, and they say a lot, and there's sort of ciphers, and we don't know what they're really thinking, and we think they can read, our minds, and all of that sort of stereotype stuff. And I think to open yourself up in this way and to say, hey, what I am is a person like you, and to sort of to bridge that artificial divide was a brave thing to do. I know young writers interested in psychiatry who are being advised not to do it. Was a brave thing to do and a generous thing to do, and I know your readers will appreciate that. So I want to begin with the title of the book. It seems to me the title of the book, Committed, has at least three meanings. One is committed in the sort of old-fashioned sense of a psychiatric patient being committed against their will to hospitalization. Committed as in being committed to your profession. And committed in the romantic sense that, we often use it negatively, as in, this person has commitment issues. I wondered if I missed any, and if as you think about these three strands of your book, the patients, the professional development, and the romantic progress, I hope that's not a spoiler, the romantic progress, whether you thought, what you thought the relationship between these stories was or is, because they're so braided. Talk more about that.
Thank you so much. I mean, that you're spot on with those three connotations with that word, and the backstory with the title is that we struggled and struggled and struggled. I had a different title. I don't see why I can't reveal it to everybody here today. Originally, I just on my computer, the book was originally called The Golden Class, and the problem with that title is that you have to read the book to know that it was sort of tongue-in-cheek that we called ourselves that. So otherwise it sounds, without reading the book, as we know we shouldn't judge books by their cover, but many people do. And so without reading it, if you don't know that you're sort of making a joke, the title doesn't work. So we racked our brains I mean, me and the editor, and at various points, the various members of the sort of team at the publisher. And we had to come up with a very short thing that conveyed multiple aspects, and those three aspects are exactly what you're talking about. So there's the professional development, there's the psychiatric term of involuntary treatment of commitment, and then there's the personal romantic commitment, right? I was very happy. The true story of this is when we spent, I don't know, a couple weeks really just back emails. Then we must have sent 100 emails. I engaged my family. I said, what do you got? Give me every title you can think of. We had so many emails going back and forth, and I was out. This is before, I don't even remember what year it was, if it was 2020 Valentine's Day, like right before the pandemic hit, or it might have been the year before. No, it had to have been Valentine's Day 2020. We were out to dinner, and my wife and I, and someone said the word commitment at the table next to us, and I said commitment, and it just like hit me like that is something that that's one word, committed in this case, that covers several of those areas. So I have mixed feelings about it, because it's even the idea of involuntary treatment still makes me uncomfortable, and part of the book, I think, is telling that story of a medical student, a medical graduate, who has to come to terms with the realities of the profession, both good and bad. So anyway, I've done a lot of speaking just now, and I'm sure I didn't answer the question fully, but let me pause.
Well, just to sort of take it a step further, I think you make it clear in the book that it's hard for you to tease apart these stories. I mean, I think that's the great charm and delight and value of the book, that you don't shy away from laying, the dating story next to the on-call story, next to the patient interaction, story, which I think, as I said, I think is generous and valuable. Why do you think it would be that, say medical students I'm talking to who are interested in writing, who are also interested in psychiatry, are being told, "Oh, career suicide. Don't do that. Don't reveal yourself that way, not only in writing but even on social media."
Yeah, there is a real active issue there. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for framing that question for me, because the world is changing and the field is changing, but not everybody in the field is changing at the same pace. So there are some psychiatrists on Twitter that are, posting extraordinarily revealing things, and I'm saying that not in a negative way. Obviously, I've revealed my whole inner world and life circumstances to the world, but so I obviously have an appreciation for that. But it's something that 50 years ago would have been unheard of, and in an era when the psychiatrist was more of a blank canvas, right? Not revealing anything about themselves unless it was for the benefit of a patient. What you're getting at, I think, also is the difference between a trainee who is dependent on the system to continue their career and progress, and someone like myself who, at the time when I was writing this book and pitching it, I was sort of like, I've got nothing to lose. I'm dealing with a life-threatening illness. I love writing. I want to tell this story. And I think the way I can tell it that will be most captivating and interesting for readers will be if I tell it like it was, which was, we were in our mid-20s and we were having these sort of interesting, dramatic kind of psychologically intertwined lives, at the same time that we were trying to be professionals and learn how to do the job. It was like, what I really hope is the reader feels like they're in our group and in the class, that they're coming along with us. And so I don't think it's career suicide. I think the world is changing for a resident or a medical student to write a self-disclosing essay. But I say that with a caveat, which is that, there are some well publicized and very public individuals who have disclosed their own, let's say, mental illness within medicine and had to be put through the ringer, because of that self-disclosure. So it's a complicated issue, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a very complicated issue because it seems there's a price to be paid for self-disclosure, and yet we know, for example, one of the reasons why physicians have such high suicide rates is because of isolation and stigma. And so how do you break the stigma without talking about it? I'm glad you brought up I'm blocking the golden
The golden class. Yeah.
class. That's right. Okay, because I want to dive a little bit into the training itself, and I want to start out with just a couple of sort of inside baseball writing questions, which I think interest people, certainly interests me. Which is, you're writing detailed scenes about patient interactions, colleague interactions that happened several years ago. How did you do that? How did you reconstruct them? And second, in terms of the confidentiality issue around writing about patients, which always comes up.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, writing about colleagues,
Mm-hmm.
including some pretty unflattering portrayals. I mean, you're hard on yourself. You're hard on some colleagues too. So, how did you put those scenes together, and how did you deal with the with privacy issues?
Thank you for that question. In typical fashion, I will say that the very first thing I'll say is just that when I read your book, I had already submitted a draft of mine and a late draft, and I thought, gosh, that author's note is framed so well, because he used some phrase about reconstructing scenes from memory and mixing and matching. And so what I want to say is that I'm going to sort of elaborate a little bit on what I've written in my own author's note, which is that you're getting at something very important, which is, how do you protect privacy of people whose stories you might be sharing without necessarily, you're sharing your perspective on those stories. Some of those are like medically private stories. Some of them are interpersonally private. How do you manage that from a writing standpoint? And so it has to start with a kernel of truth. But the easiest thing I could do from the colleague standpoint was for the vast majority of anyone who's represented in the book, if I was able to get their permission, I got their permission. So I reached out to every single one of my classmates, and they were incredibly supportive. I think there was one classmate that, from his tone, I thought maybe he didn't really want to be included, and so there's nothing there's nothing reflected of him in the book. And so that was the easiest step. The next and more difficult steps were, how do I relay clinical encounters, right, without betraying some sort of confidence, privacy, the things that we hold very important. And so I had consulted a couple of different experts in this area, and I also consulted with written materials from other memoirs. How did they, within medicine, how did they approach it? And I'm pretty open that at times I have very clearly changed, deliberately changed details to obscure identifying information. So the name, I don't really name where a lot of these things are taking place. And in fact, like 4 South, which is what I call the inpatient psychiatry unit, is an amalgam of multiple units that I rotated on. So every single person that might be represented in the book, I want them to have their own plausible deniability. If they didn't give me permission to tell their story, frankly, I don't even want them to be able to recognize themselves 100 with any kind of real certainty. And the only reason they're in the book without having given me permission is because they're essentially lost to follow-up. These things happened years and years ago, and then sort of acknowledging, this is my memory of how these things went. And, if I tried to tell a story with every colleague that I encountered and there'd be way too many characters. So I have taken the liberty of creating some composites and being very open about that. Some people are one-to-one directly represented, like myself and my wife. And some people are frankly a couple of different or a few different people combined into a single character.
Have you gotten any pushback from anybody whose story is in the book or who thinks their story is in the book?
That's a great question. I was expecting something, but not yet. So we'll see. There's still time.
Yeah. So I want to ask about psychiatry. I was just thinking that, obviously a lot has changed since my internal medicine training, advances and different diagnostic techniques and, COVID. But I think the sort of the bread and butter of my training is not all that different than the bread and butter of medicine training now. And I'm not sure that's true of psychiatry. I remember, the psychiatry residents, when I was a medical resident, they got training in therapy. Some of them wanted to be psychoanalysts. The idea of being a psychopharmacologist who saw patients for 10, 15 minutes at a time, I don't think was very well developed back then. What is psychiatric training like, or what was it a few years ago when you were in it, insofar as it reflects the current, I think, sort of very dynamic state of psychiatry?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I'm not sure that there's another field within the broad umbrella of medicine that's evolved so dramatically, and in some ways for the better, in some ways maybe not for improvement, in the last over decades, right? And so you can draw a very clear line with the advent of Prozac, fluoxetine, and how that changed prescribing patterns for antidepressants. And you can draw a pretty straight line around HMOs, health maintenance organizations, which changed the way that psychiatric services were reimbursed. And those, I think, are major factors that encouraged shorter, hospitalizations, shorter, less frequent visits. Seeing, it also exists in a fee-for-service model where you are encouraged, and not encouraged, but incentivized to see, or if you work in a system, the system might incentivize you to see more patients per hour than you would otherwise. For all those reasons, psychiatry has moved dramatically toward psychopharm heavy, right? But where I trained in what was the Harvard Longwood program, we got, like an overview. It was an unbelievable thing where we had this like luxury. We were worked, I hate to say it, almost to the bone, in eras like the night float rotations. Those were some of the hardest things I've ever gone through in my life. But from a training standpoint, we had the ability to do weekly therapy and medications with a handful of patients at a time for months and months, right? We had rotations through partial hospital programs where people were in residential programs and inpatient programs. We had the breadth of it. We saw everything, such that when I, and I don't, I do a pretty particular sort of niche thing right now, and so a lot of that is in memory at this point only. But our training was this thing that was this 4 years of, here it is. This is the breadth of psychiatry. Now choose which area you want to really focus on. And, a lot of psychiatrists right now are focusing on psychopharm practice. You have to go out of your way to do more integrated work, therapy, and meds, or therapy alone, and all the different sort of varieties that are there within.
Mhm. So, I want to go to imposter syndrome, but actually, before I do, I want to ask a question about COVID in this way. Before the program started, I was sharing with you that so many of my internal medicine patients are struggling. And especially as we sort of look to the possibility of, no end in sight with the Delta surge, and really struggling with depression and anxiety, from isolation and uncertainty, and kids in school and what's going to be. And it's not infrequent that someone in that position will ask, well, should I take meds for this?
Hmm.
And it seems both a medical and a philosophical question in some ways. How do we know, when we're talking about sort of mental and emotional life, how do we know what should be medicalized and what not? Myself, I'm a kind of a practical person. What I tell my patients is I'm not into suffering, and I just want to make people feel better. But how do you think about that, as we're all going through this angst right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're totally right about that. And I'm with you that if I have a method to relieve suffering, it's going to take a lot to convince me not to offer that method. The challenge in psychiatry in times like these, and in general, is determining, well, is this like a biological major depressive disorder that will respond to the tools in our arsenal, or would it respond to psychosocial interventions better, that kind of thing? So, how do you determine that? Uh, Very complicated, challenging, still mastering that idea. But largely, if I can hammer down with the patient, well, what's really going on, and is you know is what's happening affecting your quality of life at a biological level? Are you having trouble sleeping because of it? Trouble eating, or eating more than usual, maybe? Are you unable to focus on things, even things that should be sort of easy to focus on, or typical, that you'd typically be able to focus on? Those kinds of things, and then all the way to the extremes of, are you having suicidal thoughts, et cetera, et cetera. So if I can narrow it down to, these seem very much like psychosocial, which we're all going through together. This is a traumatic thing for a society that we're all going to be impacted by forevermore, in some way or another, just like other shared societal traumas. But on the other hand, for some people, it does present in a biological way that I think we can probably help with medications.
So I'm going to ask Adam another question or two, though I could go on for hours, but I do want to encourage those listening to put some questions in the Q&A, and we'll leave ample time to get to your questions. So about imposter syndrome. So, some people might be surprised to hear you say that you have this for two reasons. One, because, they might be inclined to say, dude, you're a Harvard doctor. How could you feel like an imposter? Well, I have my own answer to that, but not for myself when that comes in. But the second one is that from the time imposter syndrome was first described back in the 70s, it was described as a kind of gendered phenomenon. In fact, it was initially described as something that women suffered from, perhaps internalized sexism. My own sort of experience has been that it's not limited to women. But I wonder about your experience, Harvard doctor, male, as feeling like an imposter. What's it all about? What does it feel like?
Interestingly, our class, which was made up of 15 people, was 12 women and 3 men. And psychiatry is a field that draws empaths, people who connect at an emotional level. I referenced earlier that we had this like tongue-in-cheek nickname for ourselves, frankly, the Golden Class. And it was because when we arrived, everybody was talking about how well the program had done in the match. They'd gotten all these great residents from schools like Harvard and Yale and Duke and all these great places. And I'm no stranger to a good school, to a prestigious place. In my undergrad, I was in the Ivy League, and I went to SUNY Upstate Medical University for medical school, which is like an amazing place to learn. But it was a place where in Syracuse, New York, when I left Syracuse, New York, even when I interviewed at NYU, the program director didn't know, had never heard of it, essentially. And so at the time, it felt like I was looking around and I thought, this does not line up. I shouldn't be here. I should be replaced with someone from one of these other more prestigious places. And I've heard your answer at least once, at least a version of your answer about where you think it comes. And if I can paraphrase and tell me if I get it right, because I agreed with this. When I heard you say this, I agreed so hard that I want to try to get it right. So what I heard was that the more shiny the accomplishments, the more accolades that are thrown your way, I think we think potentially that the more likely imposter syndrome is to rear its ugly head, because you feel like if you're putting people into one of two categories, imposter or perfect, you're not perfect, so then therefore you must be an imposter. Did I get that about?
Yeah, that's definitely what I think. And I also think that, if you feel undeserving and in danger of being unmasked, well, poor choice of words nowadays, um, uh, you know, uh, getting all these brass rings and awards and fancy, titles and schools sort of throws gas on the fire, to mix metaphors, because you feel like, well, so here I am at Harvard, and now the jig is up, and they're all going to find out that I don't belong here. Um, did you get over it? Have you gotten over it? What made you get over it? And, not for nothing, a serious illness is a real, sort of change in identity and spirit. How did having a life-threatening disease, affect your imposter syndrome?
Thank you for that. part of the question too, because I've never thought about that in particular, that relationship. So, to the first part of the question, no, I've never gotten over it. I think I said earlier, I've sort of developed ways of identifying it. And then like a lot of things in psychiatry, and emotions are things that you can identify and sort of let pass, or you can do something with them. You can train your mind to behave in certain ways, or you can train your behaviors. But like the experience of an emotion is something you just have to go through. So these days when I spot and I'm that kind of feeling like, oh, I'm not a real writer kind of feeling, I say, oh, there it is again. Let me see what happens with it if I sit with it for a day. And so I'll sit with this conversation we're having. I'll sit with it. I'll think about it tomorrow. We'll see how it feels. A week from now, we'll see how. And that's sort of it's almost too basic to even give credit to, but like that's honestly how I end up coping around this idea. That life-threatening illness has changed my perspective on that to some degree, not because I think it's raised me up in any way. Like I still have fears about my own imperfections and inability to do X, Y, or Z. But it has lowered the stakes on everything else in the world, right? So if you said to me, we're going to take away everything except your family and your health, I'd say, we'll give you health for the rest of your life and your family. I would sign that deal today. So when I have that, I'm thinking on the fly here with this question, because like I said, I hadn't thought of it, but when you frame it in that way, then the stakes of feeling like an imposter come way down for me, because um, you know oh, if someone determines that I'm not the best psychiatrist in my division, I'm the second best. Okay, I'm the second best. That kind of thing.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be bad.
Right.
Great. Yeah. Well, I think so much of this sort of imposter thinking is this rather superficial sort of tape that plays, and it plays year in, year out. It's almost like a bad habit, like and we don't question it. And the reason I asked about your illness is is something so life-changing could make you step back and say, whoa, do I really believe that voice? Do I really believe as the writer Anne Lamott calls it, that bad radio station that plays in the background all the time? For me, I hope this isn't the case for you. For me, getting older is what changed. So don't worry, Adam. It will be over by your late 50s. You'll be fine. No, it'll
I,
be it'll be earlier, because writing really helps, because writing helps you sort of dig below that superficial tape.
yeah, I appreciate that. Something that you said just reminded me that I've started identifying with I don't know. I've started identifying with people who are much older than I am. Not that I'm not implying that you are, but I'm thinking of my grandmother who is 95 years old. And I've started identifying with her in some ways, like around the pandemic, of like, okay, uh, fate has it that we have X number of years left in our life, right? We don't know what that number is. Uh, how are we going to spend that time, and that idea is kind of freeing in some ways, I think, because it's sort of like, okay, you can respond, you can say, oh, that project that I was working on, that's not important to me, I'm not going to spend those years with that project, or this one is really great, I want to do that more, I'm going to take up this hobby that I've never taken up before, that kind of thing.
So, switching gears a little bit to psychiatric practice, Lou asks a really interesting question, which is, you mentioned time pressures that psychiatrists are under. Are psychiatrists under pressure to, quote, solve patient issues quickly with prescriptions rather than, certainly the much slower, inefficient, but
Right.
perhaps more effective process of therapy?
Right. So we have very clear data that the most beneficial things for patients are a combination of medications, therapies, and psychosocial interventions, changes to someone's life. If you can do those three things, you're much more likely to help someone with a mental health disorder than if you do one or two of those things. Where the problem becomes is the system, the apparatus that's established. So in my tiny private practice, I can do whatever I want because I'm just sort of doing it on the side, and I can see patients if I wanted to. I could see patients for 2 hours, or I could see them for 20 minutes, or whatever it might be. And when I work in a system, though, the system sort of, if it's called, as an example, in residency, we had a psychopharm clinic, and there's a chapter about this where the patients don't always sort of follow the guidelines of the clinic description. So I had a patient in the book named Oren who used those half-hour visits once a month as though they were therapy sessions, and that was very helpful for him for a period of time. So I would say that it starts with the apparatus. I don't want to defer or not own the problem because I think as a field we have to do better about it. But it's very hard to do better when the apparatus is set up to say, listen, you have to see X number of patients to make your salary. In other words, you have to be a certain level of, if you measure productivity in RVUs, which is like a medical term for how many units of productivity you've made, how many patients with what level of complexity of their problems have you solved or worked on that day. If that's where you start, you're already starting at a problem.
Yeah, and it's not unique to psychiatry, of course. In internal medicine, primary care, we're rushed to, and I have no doubt that there are times we're using prescriptions, tests, and so forth to sort of move things along. I've no doubt of that. Beth asks a really lovely question, which is about kindness. The Dalai Lama says, whenever possible, be kind. It is always possible. And Beth wonders about the role of kindness in therapeutic relationships. There's a lot of kindness in this book, I should say. A lot of love in this book, not just romantic love, and not just love of your profession, but love of your patients. So what's the role of love and kindness in your therapy?
Yeah, I think that, and for anyone who's heard me talk about the book before, you've probably heard me say this, so I apologize, but it's foundational. The first 90+% of being a good psychiatrist, or frankly a good doctor, is aligning with the person in front of you and like you're saying, being kind to them. And to me, what that means is empathy, is connecting with them. What are they here for? What's important to them? What's going on in their life that they want help with? Nobody goes to the doctor happily unless there's a reason, right? Generally speaking. And so, they're here for help. Let me make sure that what I can offer them is the same thing that they're looking for. And how do I do that? I start out by connecting with them, right? And so that's a core tenet of the book. And here where we're talking about it as kindness and love, empathy, connection at a basic human level. All of the, we talked about psychopharm, all of the techniques that we have, all the tools, the medications. I do something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a fancy device that goes on your head and uses neuronavigation with MRI guidance and all these things. All of that, I can tell you, I will do a worse job with it if I don't connect with the patient first and know what's important to them and what are our goals of their experience. So I think it's at the very heart of the book. It's at the very heart of what I try to do in my work. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. One last one, I think, which is Teresa asked, what did you hope to accomplish with the book? What do you hope readers will take from it?
I think that the very first thing that I want to accomplish is for readers to have an emotional experience with the book. I know that sounds almost So it sounds juvenile, you know, like it's like, what are you talking about? You want them to have an emotional experience. I want to be a writer that has told a story that connects with people, just the way that I want to connect with people in the office. I want to do that for anyone who picks up this book. Beyond that, you know, I hope that it gives a window that's never been opened before. It unveils this sort of experience of going from, you know, wide-eyed medical graduate to become the psychiatrist. I forget if it was during the meeting or just before the meeting that I think it was during the meeting that you referred to the reputation of a psychiatrist as all the stereotypes that go along with it. And if I could convey to a wide readership that we're people and this is like what it takes to get from here to there, and sometimes we still end up there, right? Sometimes we'll still, you know, I have a beard and I'm wearing a sports coat, and you know, like you know, sometimes the stereotypes are, we come by it honestly. And psychiatry in particular is a field with lots of scars from its past. So you know, anyway, I think that that's one thing that I hoped people would come away with. And the last thing is just that they would feel, anyone, I mean, this is really sort of narrow, but if you either, you know, someone, you yourself, you have a loved one with mental health issues, you are interested in a career that's either in the field or related to the field, you know, that it gives you a little bit of a window into like what it's like to really work there, you know, to really experience it. That's the last thing.
Well, you certainly accomplished both of those things. Reading this book is an emotional journey. Again, I won't give any spoilers, but you will find yourself rooting for certain aspects of Adam's personal life. And I think you have given a window, a unique, and as I said before, generous window. And I know I'm very appreciative as your colleague, and I know your readers will be too. And with that, we'll turn it back to Beth.
Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Thank you both. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Suzanne. I think that for most of us who don't always think about physicians as crafters of non-medical writing, you've given us a lot to think about, and both of your publications will make us think much harder about how it's all connected. So we're grateful for that. So a quick reminder about where to buy the book. There we go. If you enjoyed tonight's conversation, copies of Committed can be purchased through our partners at Trident Books in Boston. Use the link that's on the slide and in the chat, and the code BPL SHIP for free media mail shipping. They'll mail your book to you through what we used to call book rate, or now called media mail shipping, for free. And there are a limited number of signed copies available. So back to the State Library. I hope that both of our speakers tonight and all of you who are listening tonight will feel welcome to visit us in the Massachusetts State House after we reopen. We're currently closed, and the State Library staff is serving our researchers from home. But we have a great website, and if you go to it, you can learn all about our resources, our services, and our great collections. Just type in a very simple version of our URL, mass.gov/lib, and it will take you right to our homepage. So you can see from this slide that our collections cover a wide variety of formats and topics, though most of our holdings document the history of Massachusetts, its history and its government. We have a large amount of material relating to the Commonwealth, and much of it is available through our digital repository, and you can find all of that through our homepage. So while we're not open to the public for on-site visits, our services are definitely open to the public. And during the pandemic, we've developed new ways to help our researchers from home. So you're welcome to contact us for help with your research questions, and we'll be glad to provide even more expert in-person help once the State House and the State Library reopen. So tonight's talk is our last for this month. And we are working now on a whole new series of programs for the fall. So please do watch our website for news about upcoming events. There's always something new and exciting and interesting in our blog and our other social media sites. So many thanks to all of you for being here tonight. And back to Kristen for our final remarks.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Drs. Stern and Koven. Thank you for sharing your work and your conversation. And I'm really enjoying reading Committed. And I hope those of you out there will pick up a copy either at the bookstore or at your local library. The Boston Public Library has resources, services, and programs like this for all ages. You can find out more at bpl.org. And just a few of our next virtual author talks that are upcoming. On Thursday, September 2nd, we have Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar with Still Mad. On Thursday, September 14th, we have Lucy Adlington with the Dressmakers of Auschwitz. And on Thursday, September 23rd, we will be partnering with the New England Historic Genealogical Society again and the GBH Forum Network for Travels with George in Search of Washington and His Legacy. This is just the beginning of what we have scheduled for the fall, so we hope you'll check out what we have coming up. And we hope to see you either at one of our virtual programs or at one of our in-person programs soon. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to our production team, and have a good night.